I'm Michelle, a 30-year-old housewife, and my world revolves mostly around my home, my husband Bob, and our cherished cat, Marble. Bob and I have been married for 5 wonderful years, a relationship that blossomed from friendship to love, initiated by my own proposal. Despite not being able to have children, Bob and I share a deep bond, filled with mutual respect and love. He was my rock during a particularly rough patch at my job, where my days were a blend of stress and dissatisfaction. Bob was always there, not just lending an ear, but actively participating in conversations, giving advice, and even joining me for runs to help alleviate my stress. It was his attentive nature that truly won my heart, compelling me to propose to him. Our wedding was a charming affair, during which I learned that Bob had also been planning to propose to me. The news, shared by a close friend of his, added a sweet layer to our celebration. We didn't have a traditional family setup, opting instead to adopt a rescued cat that became an integral part of our lives. Marble, named for its unique mottled coat, initially kept its distance, wary from its past ordeals. But with patience and love, it eventually warmed up to us, becoming a symbol of our nurturing love. However, not everything in our life was as serene. Bob's family dynamics cast a shadow over our happiness. His stepmother, particularly, was a constant source of tension. She was extravagant and often found herself in need of money, to which Bob invariably responded, despite my concerns. This situation was complicated by the fact that Bob's father had remarried when Bob was just 10, following the death of his biological mother from an illness. Kevin, Bob's half-brother, was born shortly after the remarriage, but the relationship between the siblings was distant and strained, especially after their father's passing left Bob in charge of the family business, a role Kevin envied. On the day of the accident, the conflict reached a boiling point. Bob had been injured while driving, an event that should have elicited concern and sympathy. Instead, his stepmother coldly mocked his condition, ridiculing him for ending up in the hospital when he was supposed to be helping her. Her words, dripping with scorn, were shocking to me. "You were supposed to help me, but you ended up in the hospital yourself, that's just laughable. In this condition, the treatment will be expensive, and you won't be able to send money to me." Her lack of empathy was astonishing. As I stood there, bewildered by her harshness, Bob's uncle mentioned something utterly unrelated, yet intriguing. "Check inside the closet," he said cryptically. This sudden shift caught me off guard, but it also sparked a flicker of curiosity amid the ongoing turmoil. What could possibly be inside the closet that was so important at this moment? Resolute to find out, I decided to follow his advice, hoping it might shed some light on the situation, or perhaps offer a solution to the never-ending demands and the underlying family tensions that seemed to be tearing at the seams of our otherwise happy life. Bob and Kevin, which always left me feeling even more like an outsider. Despite all the issues, I kept trying to bridge the gap between our little family and Bob's, hoping for some form of reconciliation or at least mutual respect. During one particularly revealing conversation before we were married, Bob had been more open about his feelings while under the influence of alcohol. He confessed that he often felt like an outsider in his own family, a sentiment that seemed to haunt him from his childhood. I couldn't fit in with a mother who only bought things for Kevin. "Maybe I was just a nuisance to her because we weren't blood related," he had said, his voice tinged with a loneliness that I had rarely seen in him before. That night, Bob's words painted a clear picture of the dynamics within his family. Kevin, being the biological child, was clearly favored by his mother, which resulted in him growing up without much sense of responsibility. At 35, Kevin still lived with his mother, hopping from one part-time job to another, never committing to anything long-term. His earnings, rather minimal and sporadic, were largely spent on alcohol, fueling his frequent drunken escapades. Bob, despite being 10 years Kevin's senior, had been involuntarily roped into his brother's misadventures from a young age. Whenever Kevin got into trouble, which was often and started as early as middle school with incidents like shoplifting, it was Bob who had to clean up the mess. He would find himself at the police station, bowing his head in apology, making amends with the victims of Kevin's thefts. Over the years, Kevin's impulsive nature only seemed to worsen, evolving from petty thefts to more serious crimes like stealing bikes and even cars. The impact of these actions was a constant burden on Bob, who had to juggle the responsibilities of his own life with the fallout from Kevin's irresponsible behavior. Despite this, Bob's stepmother seemed oblivious to the strain on her elder son, focusing instead on lamenting the cost of living and Kevin's expenses, which she frequently insisted Bob help cover. Each visit to Bob's family home reinforced the stark contrast in our lives. Kevin, often sprawled on the sofa and absorbed in his smartphone, would throw casual insults my way, commenting on my appearance or making snide remarks about how I was just right for someone like Bob. These interactions, demeaning as they were, went unchecked by Bob's stepmother, who invariably sided with Kevin. Feeling increasingly alienated, I tried to maintain a dignified silence during these visits, not wanting to escalate tensions further. My hope was to somehow foster a better relationship with Bob's family, but each visit only served to remind me of the deep-seated issues that no amount of effort seemed able to fix. Mother, viewing it as his duty to support her in her widowhood. Mom must feel lonely without Dad. Despite everything, she raised me well. Now it's time to repay her, he would often say with a sincerity that made it difficult for me to argue. The depth of his familial loyalty, although admirable, often felt like a heavy anchor pulling us back every time we tried to move forward in our own lives. Each phone call from his mother was an exercise in patience. She had a knack for finding the most trivial reasons to summon us over, whether it was a flickering light bulb she claimed she couldn't reach, a ride to the grocery store she insisted she needed, or some small maintenance issue that somehow required Bob's immediate attention. It was exhausting, and every trip over the mountain to their house felt increasingly burdensome. However, despite the apparent manipulation, I kept my frustrations to myself, sharing them only with Marble, our cat, who seemed to understand my plight as much as any human could. Marble would curl up on my lap, purring softly as I stroked his mottled fur and poured out my concerns. It was during these quiet moments, away from the demands of Bob's family, that I found solace. Bob, on the other hand, continued to see these efforts as necessary, a way to stay connected and to ensure his mother was not left to fend for herself. His commitment to her was unshakable, even if it meant sacrificing our time and peace. In his eyes, the inheritance of the land and house was a responsibility as much as it was a right, and he was determined to make good use of it, possibly as a way to honor his father's memory and maybe even to atone for the perceived neglect his mother felt. As the reality of our situation became clearer, and as Bob's stepmother's demands grew more frequent and more taxing, I struggled to reconcile my love for Bob with the increasing demands of his family. Each visit, each call, each request added a layer to the growing barrier between our peaceful home life and the obligations that tugged at Bob relentlessly. While he navigated these familial waters with a sense of duty and hope, I remained by his side, supportive yet silently hoping for a change that would allow us to reclaim our time and our lives together. Know what I would do without you? Her eyes then shifted towards me, and her tone changed slightly, and Michelle, thank you for being here too. It means a lot that you'd come to help. As I set about preparing meals and tending to the household, my thoughts were conflicted. The role of caregiver had fallen into my lap almost as a matter of expectation rather than choice. I was frustrated, yet there was a part of me that understood the gravity of the situation and Bob's sense of obligation towards his mother. Each task I performed was mechanically precise, reflecting years of similar visits where the boundary between guest and caretaker blurred. While I busied myself in the kitchen, I overheard Bob and Kevin discussing their mother's condition in hushed tones. Bob's voice carried a weight of concern that resonated deeply with his ongoing sense of duty. We need to make sure Mom gets everything she needs. Maybe we should consider getting her a full-time caretaker, Bob suggested, his voice thick with worry. Kevin, who had seemed unusually cooperative since the night before, nodded in agreement but added, yeah, but who's going to pay for that? You know I'm strapped right now. The ease with which he shrugged off financial responsibility was frustratingly typical. Despite this, he seemed more engaged than usual, perhaps influenced by the gravity of their mother's illness or maybe because of the whiskey-infused bonding the night before. The conversation drifted to other matters, house maintenance, bills, and the upcoming tax payments on the land and house that Bob had inherited. "It's just a lot to handle on top of everything else," Bob admitted, and I could hear the strain in his voice. Kevin made some non-committal noises, which suggested agreement but offered no real solutions. As the day wore on, the urgency of the situation seemed to lessen, and Bob's mother showed signs of improvement. Nevertheless, the cancellation of our trip lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. I wondered about the timing of this sudden illness and Kevin's unexpected visit the night before. It felt too coincidental, yet confronting these thoughts seemed both futile and inflammatory. Bob, always the peacemaker, seemed to take everything in stride. His ability to endure and adapt to his family's needs was both admirable and, at times, deeply concerning. It was clear that his dedication was rooted in a deep familial loyalty, a trait that, while noble, often left him open to being taken advantage of by his stepmother and Kevin. As evening approached and the household settled into a quiet routine, I found a moment to step outside. The fresh air was a small relief from the stifling atmosphere of obligation and silent frustrations. Looking out over the property, I contemplated the land that was now ours, land that held both promise and burden. It was a legacy that Bob cherished, but one that also anchored us to obligations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Case scenario, he might never regain consciousness. The news was a devastating blow, one that made the room spin around me. The impact of the crash seemed to reverberate through my bones all over again as I struggled to process the doctor's words. Bob, the ever-dependable and caring husband, now lay in a state where he couldn't recognize me or even comprehend his surroundings. The thoughts of what led to the accident started to crowd my mind. Had it truly been a mechanical failure? The car had been checked recently, and everything was supposed to be in order. Yet, there we were, a trip meant for relaxation turned into a nightmare. The guilt of having survived relatively unscathed compared to Bob was overwhelming. Lying in the hospital bed, the sterile white of the room seemed to close in on me, each beep of the monitors a reminder of the severity of the situation. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that perhaps this was not just an accident but a consequence of something overlooked or ignored. My mind replayed the moments before the crash over and over. Bob's calm demeanor as he tried to control the car, his quick thinking that perhaps saved us from a worse fate, his concern for my safety even in the midst of crisis. It was all so much to take in. As days turned into weeks, I spent every possible moment by Bob's side, speaking to him, hoping for any sign of improvement. The doctors were cautious in their predictions, not wanting to give false hope, but also not dismissing the potential for recovery. The uncertainty was agonizing. Visitors came and went, family, friends, even Kevin, who appeared genuinely shaken by the incident. His usual carefree demeanor was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he was somber, often sitting in silence or making awkward attempts at conversation. It was clear that the gravity of the situation had impacted him deeply as well. During one of the quieter moments, when the room was empty except for Bob and me, I held his hand, feeling the warmth yet the unnerving stillness of it. I talked to him about everyday things, about Marble, about plans we had made for the future, anything to possibly reach him, to pull him back from wherever he was. In those long hours, the weight of everything that had transpired settled heavily on me. The family dynamics, the constant demands, the stress of dealing with everything while trying to maintain some semblance of our own life, it all seemed to converge into this single, heart-wrenching moment. I found myself wondering about the what-ifs, about decisions made and paths chosen, about how intricately our lives are woven with those we love and sometimes, with those we find challenging to love. Each day ended with a prayer, a simple request for something more, for a chance to revive the life we had, to restore the laughter and love that once filled our days. The wait continued, each tick of the clock, both a moment lost and a moment gained in the hopeful anticipation of recovery. At the hospital, the shock of hearing this was like a second collision, unbearable and jarring. I struggled to reconcile the image of Bob, who had assured me he switched to barley tea, with these new allegations of drunk driving. My mind raced, searching for explanations, for some mistake in the test, or perhaps some misunderstanding. How could this be? I stammered to my sister. He told me he was drinking tea. He was careful, he knew we had plans the next day. My sister looked at me with sympathetic eyes, her expression filled with concern rather than judgment. I know it's hard to believe, Michelle. But the police report was clear. Maybe something happened after you went to bed? Perhaps he started drinking again? The possibility that Bob might have resumed drinking after I had retired to our room for the night was distressing. Could Kevin have influenced him to start drinking again, despite knowing our plans? The thought of Kevin's earlier departure from the hospital room, his dismissive snort, and his parting remark about sending money, it all began to form a disturbing pattern. Feeling betrayed yet desperate for clarity, I grappled with these revelations. The hospital room felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls were slowly closing in with each passing second. I needed air, space to think, to breathe. I need to see the police report myself, I told my sister firmly. There has to be some explanation. Something doesn't add up. My sister nodded, understanding the depth of my turmoil. I'll help you get all the information you need, she assured me. We decided to visit the police station the next day to request the full accident report and any other relevant documents. That night, alone in the dim light of the hospital room, I watched over Bob, his face serene yet unnaturally still in the coma. The juxtaposition of his peaceful appearance with the chaos of the situation was cruel. I spoke to him softly, recounting the events, expressing my confusion and fear, and reaffirming my commitment to uncover the truth. Despite the doctor's grim prognosis, I clung to the hope that Bob might one day wake up and explain what had really happened that night. The next morning, armed with determination, my sister and I went to the police station. The officers were initially reluctant to share details, citing privacy and ongoing investigations. However, seeing our resolve and understanding our relation to Bob, they eventually allowed us to view the documents. The report was a cold recount of facts: the car's trajectory, the impact, the skid marks on the road, and the final, dreadful conclusion that Bob's blood alcohol content was significantly over the legal limit. Each word in the report felt like a blow, challenging my memories and trust. As we left the police station, the weight of the evidence was heavy on my shoulders. The drive back to the hospital was quiet, each of us lost in thought. The landscape passed by in a blur, mirroring the turmoil in my mind. I needed to confront Kevin, to hear his version of events directly from him. I needed to understand why, if it was true, Bob had chosen to drink so heavily, risking everything we had planned and cherished. Determined more than ever, I prepared myself for the difficult conversations ahead, not only with Kevin but potentially with Bob himself, should he ever awaken from his coma. The journey to uncover the truth had just begun, and I was ready to face whatever it might reveal. My niece had whispered. The tension in the air was palpable as the dial clicked with each turn. I held my breath, hoping against hope that these numbers would unlock whatever secrets Bob had felt compelled to hide away in this old safe. As the final number aligned, I pulled down on the handle. There was a heavy clunk, and then the safe door creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside, there were several manila folders, a small digital recorder, and an envelope stuffed with what looked like legal documents. My heart raced as I reached for the recorder first, pressing the play button eagerly. Bob's voice filled the room, clear and a little anxious. If you're listening to this, things didn't go as planned. I'm sorry I had to keep secrets, but I needed to protect you. Everything you need to know is in these documents and on this recorder. I love you, Michelle. Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened to his voice, a stark reminder of all we were going through. I set the recorder down carefully and then turned to the folders. They contained detailed accounts and evidence of financial transactions, some of which were linked to Kevin and my mother-in-law. It appeared that they had been siphoning money from the family business for years. There were bank statements, signed checks, and even incriminating emails that painted a clear picture of deceit. As I sifted through the documents, my sister and niece watched silently, the gravity of our discovery settling around us. I handed some of the papers to my sister, who began to read through them, her brow furrowing deeper with every page. This explains so much," she muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. Bob was trying to gather evidence against them, wasn't he? Nodding, I felt a mix of pride and sorrow. Bob had been dealing with this betrayal alone, trying to protect me and perhaps waiting for the right moment to bring everything to light. The realization that he had known about the potential danger he was in, yet chose to shield me from it until he could no longer do so, was both heartbreaking and infuriating. As we continued to examine the contents of the safe, the envelope revealed a letter from Bob's lawyer, explaining that Bob had planned to confront Kevin and his mother with the evidence at a family meeting that had been scheduled for the week after our intended hot spring trip. The timing of the car accident, now suspect, seemed too coincidental. "I need to take all this to the police," I declared, my voice steadier than I felt. "And the insurance company needs to see this as well." My sister nodded in agreement, gathering the documents and placing them back into the safe for safekeeping until we could hand them over to the authorities. My niece, meanwhile, stayed quiet, her earlier message delivered. She had done what her uncle had asked, leading us to a hidden truth that might finally bring some justice for Bob. As we prepared to leave the room, Marble trotted alongside me, his presence a small comfort in the storm of emotions. I looked down at him, grateful for his unexpected role in today's revelations. "Good boy, Marble," I whispered, giving him a gentle pat. "Let's go sort this out, once and for all." With renewed determination, I knew the next steps would be challenging, but armed with the truth, I felt ready to face whatever came next, for Bob's sake and for our future. "Keen to find out, given how urgently you searched our house." My tone was even, but inside, my heart raced with the thrill of confronting her with undeniable proof of her and Kevin's intrusion. Bob's mother clenched her jaw, the muscles in her neck tightening. "We were just looking for some important documents that Bob might have left behind," she stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "We thought they might help with his situation." Kevin, who had been silent up to this point, piped up with a nervous edge to his voice. "Yeah, we thought maybe there was something in there to help Bob, you know?" I looked between them, noting the desperation in their eyes, a sharp contrast to their usual confident demeanor. "Well, the safe was empty except for this tablet," I replied, gesturing to the device in Bob's mother's hand. "It seems you didn't find what you were looking for." Their frustration was palpable, but so was their guilt. I continued, "I've made sure to secure the house and everything in it. If there's anything specific you think could assist Bob, you should probably discuss it openly with me. Sneaking around isn't helping anyone, least of all Bob." Bob's mother opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the sound of the door swinging open. A nurse entered, her expression stern. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking from Bob's mother and Kevin to me. "No problem," I assured her quickly, giving her a tight smile. "Just a little family misunderstanding. We're handling it." The nurse nodded, though her eyes lingered on the tablet for a moment before she left the room. Once she was gone, I turned back to Bob's mother and Kevin. "I think it would be best if we all tried to work together for Bob's sake," I suggested. "If there's anything else you need to discuss, I'm here." Bob's mother tightened her grip on the tablet, her expression unreadable for a moment. Finally, she nodded slowly, a reluctant agreement forming. "We'll let you know," she muttered, her voice low. As they left the room, I exhaled deeply, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. I knew this confrontation was just the beginning of a long struggle to uncover the full extent of their deceit and to protect both Bob and our assets. I leaned back against my pillow, my mind already racing with plans and possibilities, determined to fight this battle not just for Bob's recovery, but for the truth to prevail. Seeing him, which is how we initially got suspicious. The more we looked into it, the more things just didn't add up. My tone was controlled, yet I could feel the anger brewing beneath the surface as I recounted the facts. Bob's mother was visibly struggling to process the information. Her face had gone from red to ashen, her anger replaced by a creeping realization of the implications of her son's actions. "Kevin, why would you do something like this?" She turned to him, her voice a mix of anger, confusion, and pain. Kevin's face was buried in his hands, his body shaking as he repeated, "It's not true," his voice muffled and weak. It was clear he was overwhelmed, unable to confront the reality of the situation or to provide any form of explanation that could justify his actions. I continued, my voice firmer. Not only did Kevin fail to help at the accident scene, but he actively made it worse by trying to set up Bob with a DUI charge. This footage, I gestured to the tablet which now lay on the ground between us, clearly shows Kevin pouring whiskey into Bob's mouth. It's undeniable proof that Bob was not responsible for what happened. Bob's mother picked up the tablet slowly, her hands trembling as she rewatched the video. After a few moments, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I had no idea. Her voice trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. I softened my approach slightly, seeing her distress. "I know this is hard to accept, but we need to deal with the reality of what happened. Bob could have died because of what Kevin did. We're lucky he's only in a coma and not worse." Kevin was now sobbing openly, his body convulsing with each cry. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he managed to say, between sobs. "I was scared. I thought if Bob was blamed, it would all just go away." Bob's mother stood up slowly, her posture that of someone carrying a heavy burden. "What have you done, Kevin?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. She then turned to me, her expression one of a woman defeated. "What do you want to do now, Michelle?" I looked between them, my mind clear on what needed to be done, but also aware of the complexity of the situation involving family. "First, we ensure Bob's health is no longer jeopardized. Then, we take all this evidence to the police. It's not just about what happened to Bob anymore, it's also about justice, and making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Bob's mother nodded, wiping away her tears. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "We need to make things right, for Bob." As Kevin continued to weep on the ground, I felt a mix of pity and anger. It was a complicated tangle of emotions, but my primary focus remained clear: ensure Bob's safety and seek justice for his wrongful suffering. We gathered up the evidence, preparing to take our next steps, united by a tragic circumstance, but driven by the necessity of accountability and rectification. My wrist tightly, her eyes fierce and desperate. "You have to understand, we had nothing left. I didn't think it would go this far," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the strain. I gently pulled my hand away, my heart conflicted but my resolve firm. "Understanding your desperation doesn't excuse the actions taken," I said softly yet firmly. "You put Bob's life at risk. You can't manipulate and endanger lives just because you're struggling financially." Kevin remained on the floor, his body still, but his eyes haunted as he listened to our exchange. The weight of his actions and their consequences seemed to crush him even further into the ground. I stood up, holding the recorder in one hand and the notebook in the other. "This evidence is going to the police. What you did is beyond forgiveness on a personal level. It's criminal," I stated, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. My mother-in-law's face hardened, and she wiped her tears away abruptly, her brief moment of vulnerability vanishing. "Do what you must," she said coldly, resignation lacing her voice. I nodded, turning to leave the rooftop garden. "I will do exactly that. It's not just about what you need or want anymore. It's about justice for Bob and preventing this from happening to anyone else." As I walked away, I felt the gravity of the entire ordeal settling on my shoulders. The drive to the police station was quiet, my thoughts loud in the silence. Arriving at the station, I handed over the notebook and the voice recorder to the detective in charge. They listened intently, their expressions growing graver with each passing moment. "This is serious," the detective finally said, his tone grave. "We'll need to bring them in for questioning immediately. It's clear this wasn't just financial desperation, it was a calculated attempt to commit fraud and potentially worse." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. "Thank you for taking this seriously," I said. "I just want to ensure no one else is harmed by such selfish actions." The detective assured me they would handle everything from here, and I left the station feeling a slight ease for the first time in days. However, the relief was bittersweet, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult for everyone involved. Returning to the hospital, I visited Bob, who was still lying unconscious. Sitting beside his bed, I held his hand, whispering updates about the situation. "I'm handling everything, Bob. Just focus on getting better," I murmured, hoping somehow my words could reach him. The battle for justice had begun, but my fight was twofold: for Bob's health to improve and for his wrongdoers to face the consequences of their actions. As I sat there, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. For Bob, for our future, I was ready to face whatever came our way. As Kevin and my mother-in-law were escorted out of the hospital room by the police, the reality of their situation seemed to finally hit them. Their heads hung low, and the clinking of the handcuffs punctuated the heavy silence that followed their exit. It was a scene that brought a mix of satisfaction and sorrow to me. Once they were gone, I turned to the detective and my sister, still standing by the door. "Thank you," I said earnestly, my voice a bit shaky from the confrontation. "This couldn't have happened without your help and the investigators' quick action." The detective nodded, his face serious, but with a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "It's our job to make sure justice is served, especially in cases like these where trust and safety are compromised. We'll make sure they answer for what they've done." My sister stepped forward, her expression one of relief mixed with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, eyeing the slight tremor in my hands. I managed a small smile. "Yeah, I think I will be. It's just a lot to take in. Seeing them finally facing the consequences, it's surreal." "We've done what needed to be done," she said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Now, it's up to the courts to decide what happens next." We walked out of the hospital room together, leaving behind the scene of so many revelations and confrontations. As we stepped into the corridor, the buzz of the hospital enveloped us, a reminder that life continued to move forward, even in the midst of personal upheavals. Outside, the air was crisp, and the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the parking lot. We headed towards her car, each step feeling lighter than the last. "What will you do now?" my sister asked as we reached her vehicle. "I need to focus on Bob's recovery," I replied, looking back towards the hospital windows. "Everything else is secondary. He needs to know he's not alone in this, and that the people who betrayed him are being held accountable." As we drove away from the hospital, the conversation turned to lighter topics, a much-needed break from the intensity of the day. Yet, in the back of my mind, the images of the day replayed: Kevin pouring whiskey into Bob's mouth, the discovery of the tampered brakes, the arrest. These would stay with me, a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the depth of deceit people could sink to. But there was also a sense of closure, or at least the beginning of one. The wheels of justice were turning, and I had played my part in setting them in motion. Now, it was time to focus on healing, on rebuilding the trust and security that had been so shaken, and most importantly, on helping Bob find his way back to a life full of the love and safety he deserved. As my niece whispered in my ear, her words sent a flush of excitement and a hint of nervousness through me. "Auntie, you're going to have a baby," she said, her eyes wide with the innocent confidentiality of a child who had just shared the best secret. I stood there, momentarily frozen, my thoughts racing. Could it be true? The idea seemed both wonderful and overwhelming. My sister, catching the look on my face, gave me a knowing smile as she passed by, her comment about the stork adding a playful tease to the moment. I closed the door behind them and led everyone into the living room, where Bob was setting up extra chairs. My mind was still on what my niece had said. The thought of a child, our child, seemed like a new chapter waiting to unfold, one that could bring even more joy into our lives. But I wasn't sure yet, it was too early to tell, and the surprise must be confirmed. As the evening went on, the house filled with laughter and the aromas of the feast I had prepared. Bob was in high spirits, sharing jokes and stories with my sister's husband, completely unaware of the quiet storm of emotions inside me. After dinner, as everyone settled into more comfortable conversations, I found myself watching Bob with a mixture of love and anticipation. Later, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Bob and I sat on our porch, looking out at the stars. It was the perfect moment to tell him, yet I hesitated, wanting to be absolutely sure before changing our world forever. "Today was wonderful, wasn't it?" Bob said, taking my hand in his. "It was," I replied, my voice soft. "Bob, there's something I need to check before I can share it with you. Something potentially life-changing." Bob looked at me, curiosity piqued. "That sounds serious. Everything okay?" I smiled, squeezing his hand. "It's more than okay. It could be amazing. I just need a little time to be sure." His expression softened, his trust in me complete. "Take all the time you need. I'm here, no matter what it is." I leaned against him, feeling the strength of his support. The possibility of expanding our family, after all the turmoil, felt like a reaffirming whisper of life's continuity and our shared future's promise. I decided I would take a test the next day, but for that night, I simply enjoyed the peace of being with the man who had stood by me through everything, whose love had proven steadfast and true. Wrapped in the tranquility of the night and the certainty of our love, I felt ready for whatever news the next day might bring. For now, the secret bubbled within me, a spark of potential joy that made tomorrow an eagerly awaited mystery.